it's really nice to have Sara here, and that's all I have to say. So Sara, thank you. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
So I need to begin by saying thank you for the invitation. It's really delightful to have gotten it. If Monima yesterday was saying, oh, it's so nice to be counted as a historian, I'm standing up here thinking, wow, they think I'm a philosopher. So I am primarily a logician, and I'm going to talk about logic, but this isn't just a talk for logicians or people interested in logic. Hopefully it'll be something that everybody can get here. When John and Zita first invited me, I wrote back and said, what I really want to talk about is this topic in the history of logic. And but it's like, I'll do something that's like proper philosophy if you want. And they wrote back and said, no, we want the logic. So at least I'm talking to you and Pri. I'm talking to you as well. But the rest of you, hopefully, you've got some interests in logic. But if not, oops, that's the wrong direction. There we go. I've got a couple of starting points for this talk. Let's just kind of get them out of the way to start off with. As I said, I'm a logician. I can pretend to be a philosopher, but it's a lot of work, and I don't always enjoy it. Because I really, really, really love logic. And that's where basically everything that I do stems from. But I recognize that in this context, you are not all logicians. You might not all love logic, and that's okay. While I'm speaking, you can replace logic with your own subspecialism and see how far my argument goes. Because I suspect that a lot of what I'm going to say is not specific about logic, and that I hope that there are lessons that are more broad, more useful, more relevant, things that will get you to think about some questions that maybe you haven't thought about before in terms of what does the history of your particular subspecialism have to say about the future of that particular subspecialism. So there's a lot of reasons why logicians might care about logic. There's the scientific curiosity, learning things. There's always open problems. There's always new things to do. There's always new logical systems to develop. In a sense, it's actually rather like doing medieval philosophy in that there's always new texts to discover, new texts to read, new texts to edit, to translate. And it's fun. There is no other intellectual exercise that I find more fun than solving logic puzzles or creating them. Both are good. Logic is particularly nice because it's applicable. I mean, okay, granted, when I was doing my dissertation, I was writing on modalities in medieval logic, and the most general question that I got from medievalists, from logicians, from anybody was, why does it matter? And I used to have like really good questions about how, this, that, and the other thing, and I am now late enough in my career that I can say, all that matters is that I find it fun and interesting, and this should be sufficient grounds for us to investigate a historical subject. We want to be working and living in a society that promotes the flourishing of humans, and for some humans, many who are in this room, studying old things because they are interesting contributes to our flourishing. But logic is also interesting in ways that maybe some aspects of medieval philosophy are not, because it's applicable. You can go off and you can get computers to do things with it. And then we also care about logic because we want to write publications, because we want to get jobs, because we want to be able to eat, and all of these other practical things. So a wide variety of reasons why logicians care about logic. But I'm going to set aside kind of the pragmatic concerns and focus more on the sort of the scientific curiosity, the fun, the excitement, the way that it can kind of contribute to human flourishing, at least for particular types of humans. So this is always a fun question that I ask when I'm in a mixed group. So is it a mixed group of logicians and philosophers, or is it a mixed group of philosophers and historians? And the question is, who are you? Are you a logician? Are you a philosopher? Are you a historian? Are you a philosopher or a logician or a historian? Are you something else? So if I asked you, are you a logician? Who'd raise your hand? Come on, come on. Yeah, Maria Len, you also count. Okay, are you a philosopher? Are you a historian? Okay, so we got some people who are putting their hands up for more than one thing. So if I were to then ask you, are you a philosopher or a logician or a historian? So lots of hands going up because you have all studied your logic and know that or is inclusive. I tried to emphasize the or in order to get you the exclusive reading, but classical logic, it's so ingrained in you. Are you something else? There might be some other something else's in here. But one of the things about this is that if you've got somebody who only raised their hand for one of the first three, and you ask, if you go up to somebody who raised their hand for historian, you say, oh, are you a philosopher? They're probably gonna go, I mean, I still sometimes get that feeling when people call me a philosopher. We'll get to reasons why. But the point that I want to draw out from here is something about our social identities. Who we are, what we think about what it is that we are doing, and to tell a logician that they are not a logician, or to tell a philosopher that they're not a philosopher, or a historian that they're not a historian, it's more than just saying that they've got bad fashion sense or unacceptable tastes in ice cream. It is something that is striking at, for many people, some aspect of their identity, who they are. So for me, being a logician is very central to my sense of self. Part of what drew me to the study of logic when I was, late teenager, early undergraduate, was that logic gave me the tools that I needed to help make sense of the world. Not just, kind of abstract reality, but concrete tools that I could use for navigating social relationships. And so my identity as a logician is very close to me. And this is because logic and the study of it, and eventually kind of research, and also the teaching of it, have given me a way of inhabiting the world that makes it safe, makes it comfortable. There are rules, there are certainties, there are truths. You have a proof or you don't. When I was first marking undergraduate logic assessments, I wanted to have one rubber stamp that just said wrong. Because sometimes you can see an error somebody's made and you can say, you tried to apply this rule and you didn't quite get it right, here's why. And sometimes you're just wrong. It's the most useful thing I can say, but I know that I'm right in saying it. Now, this is something specific to me, but I'm sure that you all have something in what drew you to what you are doing today that feels very central to who you are. So why, going back to the question of why do we care about logic, we care about it because it's integral to our sense of selves. So it's not just this fun little thing that we do on the side. I've got plenty of other activities that I find that are fun, intellectually satisfying, I learn things, but they aren't central to my identity in the same sort of way. The consequence that comes from all of this is that not just given that I care about logic, but the reasons why I care about logic are reasons why I should want as many people as possible to have access to it. So this kind of transformative experience that I went through when I discovered logic and became a logician was so valuable to my own sense of self and well-being that this is an opportunity I would like everybody to have. Not everybody is going to have it, but everybody should have the opportunity to have it. Again, substitute philosophy, history, whatever subspecialism you have into this, and I hope you all feel the same sort of way. The value that you have gotten from being able to do what you do is value that should be available to as many people as possible. This is where the history of logic comes in. Because if we look at logic as a discipline nowadays, it's still very exclusionary. I'm going to speak mostly in terms of excluding gender minorities, but it's not just that. I will touch on some of the other kind of intersectional aspects of the exclusion of logic as a discipline, but the joke I always like to say is that logic sits in the uncomfortable intersection of philosophy, which we know has a gender problem, computer science, which definitely has a gender problem, and mathematics, which guess what? Has a gender problem. And logic inherits the worst of all these worlds. There are like sub-areas of philosophy where women are very well represented. There are sub-areas of mathematics, of computer science, but logic is not yet one of them. So my logic career started in 1998. The first time that I was ever in a logic-based research activity, research or teaching, where women outnumbered the men was 2018. And this was a dedicated workshop on formal logic and feminist philosophy, which was invitation only, so doesn't really count. I was 35 when I looked around a research event and realized I'm the senior woman. 35 is too young to be the senior woman in a discipline. I have never been taught in a formal university logic class by a woman. In fact, I didn't even have any women teaching me philosophy. All of my women teachers as an undergrad were in the English department. So this is just to give you a sense of, philosophy as a whole has gotten so much better. Logic as a subdiscipline, we are still struggling. And I want to say something about, basically my argument is the best way that we can understand where we are now, which we have to do in order to understand what do we need to do to get better in the future, is we've got to look at where did all of these exclusionary practices come from. So we've got to look to the past. So, because lots of you are not logicians, I will give you a chronology of the history of logic. This is the one that you probably all know. There was Aristotle. Okay, there's enough ancient philosophers. You're not old, but in the room that you guys also know about the Stoics, so I'll put them on there. But then there was Frege and Russell and Wittgenstein, and then a little bit after that you get Lewis and Quine and Barkin and Kripke, and then if you know something about kind of modern logic, you've got modal logic, so alethic, deontic, doxastic, epistemic, temporal, agentive. You've got dynamic versions, you've got multi-agent versions, and at this point you're now we've left philosophy and we are off in computer science and we're doing math and we are not philosophical enough. This is what my husband and I were told when we were trying to submit logic prelim papers for our philosophy program in the US about 2 decades ago. And that, along with our logic advisor retiring and not being replaced, is why we ended up leaving that program and going someplace else, and why 25 years on, I had a bunch of philosophers tell me at a very formative age that what I was doing was not philosophy. So this is why it's very nice to be here talking to you guys about it. But of course, okay, you can see that there's some gaps. And okay, some of you out there is like, but the early moderns, well, what about Leibniz and what about Kant? No offense to any Kant scholars here, I've never understood why you guys count him as a logician, because as a logician, he does not feature anywhere in our intellectual history. But I'll put him there because I knew somebody would say, well, what about Kant? Okay, but there is also, there's more in that big gap. You've got something that gets you from Aristotle to Leibniz, and well, it's Boethius. He translated Aristotle, he made the Greek inheritance of logic available to the West, and this is how you get developments like Peter Abelard, William of Ockham, names that if you're not medievalists or not logicians, you might still have heard of or know a little bit about. But there's other people in there. William of Sherwood, Lambert of Auxerre, Peter of Spain, Roger Bacon, all of the other 14th century people, which I was too lazy while writing my slides during the AGM last night to actually list all of their names. There's also too many of them. But there's a lot going on between Kant and Frege. And you get in the 19th century, Lad Franklin, Jones, Stebbing. Okay, there's also a bunch of men, like Boole, De Morgan, Venn. I actually literally forgot about putting them on there. But when we start kind of broadening our, filling in the gaps in the history of logic, it's like, oh, there were women, kind of on the later side, but they were there. But there's also other people that you may be familiar with, but not necessarily as logicians, like Anselm of Canterbury, who wrote the first modal account of agency in some of his fragmentary works that were only published after his death. There's also the early Buddhist logicians, which we've heard a little bit about already, Vasubandhu, Dignaga, Dharmakirti, lots of other people. And at this point, we're not just looking at this single tradition that started with Aristotle and has this unbroken red thread line that can be traced up to the modern era. We're looking more broadly. It's like, what, maybe not where does Aristotelian logic and its inheritance turn up, but where can we find things that look, act, and function like logic in other contexts? So nobody disputes that what Vasubandhu and Dignaga and these people were doing was logic. It's very clearly logic. But once you start asking the question of, well, what can we find that isn't necessarily just the Aristotelian, Stoic, Greek kind of tradition, then you get to ask things like, well, what about in ancient China? And there's actually it's not quite a dispute, but it's an ongoing conversation as to whether any of the things that are found in ancient Chinese philosophy get to count as logic. And this year, for the first time, in my introductory logic class, the textbook that we work from is called What is Logic? And that's the question we start off with and the question that we end with. And I actually made them read Gongsun Lung's White Horse argument from the Warring States period, so very, very ancient Chinese. And one of the questions that we had after we'd kind of looked at the arguments and talked about them was, did it make sense for me to have talked about this in the context of an introduction to logic class? Interestingly, perhaps because of the way I was trying to set up the entire course, they were all completely happy with this showing up alongside propositional logic and predicate logic and the syllogistic and things like that. But what this shows is that there's a lot of history of logic that we can be looking at. This is by no means complete. There are plenty of other people that could be put in. There are also other kind of cultural contexts that are at this point still vastly, vastly understudied and deserve to have the same sort of attention given to them as, as has been happening with the medieval European tradition and increasingly the Buddhist tradition and so on. So why does all of this matter? Because, yes, if you start with Aristotle, there is kind of a continuous thread that can be traced all the way up to modern logic. It doesn't catch everything on this list, but it catches a lot of it. And a lot of, what we are doing as logicians nowadays, we can look back into the past and we can find people doing the same things. So, okay, why does it matter that you know something about the history of logic if you are a logician? This is an argument that I often have to make when I'm giving talks to logicians, because they're like, yeah, I'm just going to prove my theorems and stuff. Why does the history matter? Well, the first point is very straightforward. It's about priority claims. There are lots of things where we assume that one person was the first person to prove this result or to develop this technique. You can only make those kinds of statements if you actually have looked at the history and know whether this is true or not. So a classic example of this is the De Morgan laws for propositional logic, which are completely and fully articulated in William of Ockham. There is also, and this is due to work that Suzanne Bobstein has been doing, showing that Frege's development of propositional logic, not nearly as innovative and radical as you might have thought, because she has drawn very explicit comparisons with the Stoic material that he was likely plagiarizing from. So you guys are all historians or historian adjacent. I don't need to justify to you that it is important that we look to the history of our subject so that we are just correct when we say so-and-so was the first one. Learning new things. This is one of the biggest reasons why I do the history of logic, is because I learn things that are relevant to the study of modern logic. Because, as I said, they were doing the same sorts of things that we were doing. So I can pick up a 13th century text on modality, read about it, read about the operators they introduced, the truth conditions that they have, and I might find something new. Because what they're doing is the same, but why, or what the background assumptions are, or what the general context is, often is not. And so if you have different starting points, but the same activity, you're going to end up in different places. And some of those places might be of interest to the modern day. The third kind of why does all of it matter is, again, something I don't have to justify to all of you. It's about interrogating questions about the canon and possibly revising it. But it's very closely tied to the question of, okay, if we want to revise the canon of logic, then we have to know something about A, what counts as logic, so what is logic, but B, who gets to be a logician? Like, what's the standard of activity or practice or publication that one has to meet in order to be a logician? And one of the exercises that I give my intro class, I've been doing this for a number of years now, it's brilliant because it doesn't require them to have any logical knowledge whatsoever, which means that I can assign it if their first seminar happens before the first lecture is scheduled, which happens more often than not. I ask them to find me 3 logicians who lived before 1000, 3 who lived between 1000 and 2000, and 3 who either died after 2000 or are still alive. And at least one of them, they need to read up on that person a little bit and find out 1 or 2 interesting things about them. And then everybody comes into the room, there's usually between 10 and 15 people, and I just have them go around the room, tell me who they have, and I put a great big chronology up on the board. And it's a wonderful exercise, A, because it gets everybody used to the fact that I expect them to speak and to have done the work in advance. But from the kind of more philosophical point of view, there's always going to be somebody who prefaces one of their people with, I'm not sure if so-and-so counts as a logician. And then we get to have conversations about that. The first time I did this, I also had people kind of look at the result and just tell me anything that struck them about it. And there was some puzzled silence, and then somebody gasped and was like, there's no women. And I also had to point out there's no women, there's no non-Western people, there's no this, there's no that. I'm pleased to say that having done this exercise for about 7-8 years now, this isn't an issue. So already in like the last decade, this is changing at a wide enough level that second-year undergrads coming in are going to find the Buddhist logicians, are going to come up with, the Arabic logicians, they've been showing up for ages now. There's always going to be at least one woman, and people are kind of attuned to this, but also kind of very conscious of the fact that this then means there are these questions. Who gets to count? And this goes back to kind of the access question, the inclusion and exclusion. Who are we bringing into the field, and who are we saying doesn't get to be a part of it? So, okay, I'm gonna go through each of these in a little bit more detail, but I've already mentioned kind of De Morgan and Occam. There's also quite a newish development in modern logic looking at connexive logics, which are ones that are trying to revise the conditional in a way that ensures there's a kind of a content or subject matter connection between the antecedent and the consequent. And connexive logicians like to trace their roots back, actually, to Aristotle and Boethius. The idea that Aristotle says that no sentence follows from its negation. And for like the vast majority of sentences, this is true, but in classical logic, a tautology will follow from the negation of a contradiction, because the negation of a contradiction just is that tautology. Another principle is that no sentence follows from both itself and its negation. But if you have P and not P, everything follows. So, yeah, actually, I'm not gonna say more about these, because the interesting questions are the canon revision ones. What gets to count as logic? Who gets to count as a logician? And who gets access to logic? Because, of course, one of the questions that, as kind of canon revision, particularly incorporating women philosophers into philosophy curriculum, became much more kind of part of the mainstream conversation 10, 15 years ago, people started asking, like, well, you do medieval logic, were there any women? And this, you can't answer that question straightforwardly unless you know, well, what is kind of the level of logical activity that one has to get to in order to count as a logician, and also who are the people that had access to that kind of activity. So, unsurprisingly, access to a particular subject is constrained by what type of group you are in. Gender, class, race, culture, ethnicity, intersectional combinations of these. So at some times when we are looking to broaden our canon, to expand what we are looking at, there are going to be some contexts where we just won't find anybody of the right kind of demographics out there, because the structures were set up in such a way that they were systematically excluded. So how does exclusion happen? And this is what we're all kind of familiar with in doing canon revision projects. There's the post hoc exclusion. So there were women who did logic, were part of the logic community at the time. They were kind of integrated into the networks along with everybody else. But for whatever reason, misogyny, their contributions have been ignored or forgotten since. And now we're kind of rediscovering them, and we aren't including them, we are just making it known that they were included. So these include people like Christine Ladd Franklin, other women working in foundations of mathematics more generally in that kind of 1870s to 1920s period. Ruth Barkin, who thankfully at this point I think can be considered mainstream, thanks to the work of Federica Janssen-Lauret. But there's also the anti-hoc exclusions. And that's the question of, well, why is it that some women and other people never managed to get into logic at all? And this is a question that we need to be asking both nowadays. If you look at who are the people who are taking introduction to logic classes, if a lot of undergraduate bodies are fairly roughly gender balanced. Within a philosophy program, I don't actually know what the numbers are, but they're getting a lot better. But it's still the case that if you look at a logic class, the gender distribution in a logic class is not going to reflect the gender distribution of either the program that the class sits within or the student body of the university as a whole. So why why are women deselecting themselves from taking these classes? There are a number of different kind of reasons why you've got kind of structural exclusion from the study of logic. So the first is quite straightforward and depends not specifically on logic, but on the broader educational opportunities that, that people have. I've got 4 basic little kind of case studies or anecdotes on interesting intersections between access to logic and underrepresented groups that I would like to share. The first is, so people would ask me, were there any medieval women logicians? And the easy answer to give to that question, I can even give you a syllogism, all logic was done in universities, no logic admitted women, therefore there were no women logicians in the Middle Ages. But universities weren't the only educational contexts that women had access to, and in fact, if you were, a kind of upper class, upper middle class woman, particularly with connections to the church, you actually probably had a pretty good access to education. You would have studied Latin, you would have done grammar, you would have done rhetoric. Oh, look, that's 2 of the things of the trivium. What about logic? So for instance, we know that Eloise studied rhetoric and grammar. She had to have studied grammar in order to be able to read and write Latin. We know that she studied the rhetoric because she references Cicero in her letters. She was studying with the most eminent logician in the world at the time. Have not been able to find any evidence that she actually studied logic. And when you look at, particularly kind of the pre-university stage when most of the education was happening in convent schools and monasteries and nunneries and things like that, where we have information about what was taught to women, it's quite explicit that they were doing the sort of thing that they needed to be able to become virtuous, to educate themselves, to support their, the fellow people in their religious community, to raise virtuous children. All of these things are very private. Logic, as this particular verbal discipline, was very public-facing in nature, particularly once you moved up to the university period. Part of instruction in logic included participation in public debates. So if you are, by your gender, not suited to public roles, then why do you need to study logic? You're not going to be having a quadlibettal disputation out in the marketplace. You're going to be buying eggs or something. And apparently we don't need logic to do that. This is something that I find really interesting. There is a kind of strong kind of push towards the conclusion that one of the reasons why you won't find, and I'm pretty happy to, well, not happy, but I'm confident in saying that you will not find women logicians in the Middle Ages, is because logic had this very public-facing outward sort of aspect, which was inappropriate for women. Super interesting is that when you then look at Christine Ladd Franklin, who studied with Peirce at Johns Hopkins University, first American woman logician, first woman to complete the requirements for a mathematics PhD at Johns Hopkins, even though she didn't get it for like another 50 years. She originally wanted to study astronomy, but astronomy at the time, that's the sort of thing that you do in labs with telescopes with men. This is not a suitable occupation for a well-bred, well-educated young woman, and so she was gently shunted into pure mathematics, from which she eventually got into logic, because mathematics was a private activity. It was the sort of thing that you could do in the privacy of your own home without having to go out and fraternize with the menfolk. So there's this very interesting kind of change from the Middle Ages to the 19th century where logic's position shifting from a public-facing activity to a more private-facing one is what is correlated with women having access to it as a subject to study and do research in. A second anecdote is in the late 17th century, so it's like 1666, John Eliot, a Puritan missionary who has gone over to the New World, super interested in the indigenous languages in kind of the Boston area, wrote a grammar, wrote a syntax. He's often held as like the first modern sort of linguist because he worked from the assumption that these languages could explain to him what their grammar were on the basis of their grammar, rather than trying to reduce the indigenous languages to Hebrew, because of course the people living in America were the lost tribe of Israel. He also was like, you know what the thing I need to have in order to be able to convert the indigenous people to Christianity? I need a logic textbook, because this is the thing that will get them to understand how to reason from scriptural principles to the evident conclusions of Christianity and Christian theological tenets. So this book is fascinating. I've written a paper on it. If anybody's interested, I can give you the reference after. But at the time, about 1,000 copies were printed. Most of them were destroyed during one of the colonizer native wars. And by the end of the 19th century, there were, I think that there are 6 of the original copies left. And at one point, at the end of the 19th century, somebody went and printed a new edition because they're like, we can't let this get destroyed. But one of those original editions, it's in the British Library, they scanned it, it's on Google Books, you can get the PDF, and you can have the same experience that I did, which was, the title is all in English. So I pulled up this PDF, looked interesting, opened it up, and found it is a bilingual textbook, interlinear, Wampanoag, and English. And that was the point at which I realized this was the first time in my life, and this was like maybe 5 years ago, that I had ever seen an indigenous American language in print before. So that was very interesting. But this is an educational opportunity, yes. Now these people have access to the study of logic. Are they going to go off and become logicians? Are they going to go off and become Christians? Probably not. Another interesting case is Almira Phelps, who published lectures for young ladies in the 1833, and she was teaching at a ladies' seminary in the South and in the US. And at the time, one of the chapters in her book was logic. So again, I haven't looked at her much yet. She's like my next project, is to get access to her works and look at like what kind of logic is she teaching. But she clearly thought that this was the sort of thing that a 19th century girl should have access to. And then, again, specifically on educational opportunities for women, Lewis Carroll's Game of Logic textbook that was written at the end of the 19th century was set up to be a correspondence course for girls' high schools. So there's a lot of, it's a fairly obvious point, but when there are educational opportunities for women to learn logic, then they have the opportunity to become logicians, and when they don't, they don't. But there's more to it than just what kind of, when do women get to learn things? When do they get educated? Is logic part of the curriculum? But there's also substantial questions of rationality, because logic, unsurprisingly, is deeply connected to reason, which is deeply connected to reasoning, which is deeply connected to rationality. And if we go back to Aristotle, man is rational animals. So in a sense, like the capacity or the inclination to logic is built into us. No. It's built into the men. But only the right kind of men. Not all of the men. And you see this particularly in looking at the reception of the Buddhist logic textbooks into the into the kind of British colonial elite at the beginning of the 19th century. So Jonathan Ganeri has an excellent chapter, Indian Logic and the Colonization of Reason. I make my students read it every single year because it is, to put very simply, one of the tenets underlying the British colonial imperial project was bringing civilization to the uncivilized. And what is civilization? Civilization is the inheritance of ancient Greece, including primarily their philosophy and their logic. And so civilization is a way of taking things that are, animals that are maybe not yet rational and making them rational. It's taking things that aren't quite yet persons and making them persons. And so, of course, if this is why you think beyond, tea and spices and silk and, money, if this is the story you're telling yourself as to why it's okay to establish an empire in India, and then you find these texts on inference and explicit arguments that are characterized by their formal structure, now you've got a much harder story to tell. Because it can't be that you are bringing logic to the illogical and turning them into civilized humans because they've already got logic. And so the next story that they start to try to tell is, well, okay, they were trying to do syllogisms, but bless them, they did it very badly. There's too many statements, and there's these weird examples, and it doesn't work, and you can try to turn them into syllogisms, but they're not very good syllogisms. So, okay, it's fine. We can still colonize them. As I said, this is a very kind of superficial explanation of the story, but it's a significant component of what was going on. And this idea that you get to sort of class people according to, you can divide those who get to count and those who don't get to count on the basis of reason and rationality is something that is still quite pervasive. It gets used all of the time against women. And this is a context in which I want to kind of explicitly say that questions of reason, rationality, logic get turned into weapons that are used to shut people out of discourse, to silence them, to essentially say, I don't have to engage with you because you are not the right kind of person. So this, the simple example of this is when a woman is told, be more logical, be more rational, you're too emotional. That's a way of saying, I don't have to include you in my conversation until you act in the way that I want you to. So this is very closely, these kind of patterns of exclusion are very closely tied to who gets to count. Who gets to count as civilized, who gets to count as human, who gets to count as a reasonable interlocutor, who gets to count as an authority or somebody who gets to participate in the conversation. And this is a point that I'm continually trying to get my students to realize, that while logic is this fun game that we can go off and do, it is situated in this broader context where it is very easy to take logic, knowledge of it, mastery of it, or ignorance of it, or misapplication of it, and use this as a way to shut people down. Basically, I tell my students, you are not allowed to use logic or any of the adjacent words to do this. And if you see other people doing it, you need to step up and you need to say something. Because the end result of this is that it's not just people get excluded from the opportunity of studying formal logic at university, but they get excluded from fully participating in society. And so going back to kind of that original point that I made about how we want to live in a society where everybody gets to flourish to the extent that they can, okay, maybe, the person who would really love logic but never got a chance to study it, that's a small diminishment in their flourishing. But the person who doesn't even get to participate in the system at all, that is a very big diminishment on their flourishing. So I'm kind of, realizing I'm getting close to the end of my slides, and this might mean that we end up having a lot of time for discussion and questions, but I think that that's probably a good thing because, as I said, this is primarily about kind of the history of logic, but there's at least some lessons here that I hope you will find relevant for your own particular subfields. And hopefully in the Q&A we can talk about some of these. So why does the history of logic matter? So if we care about logic, we should care about who gets access to it. And right now, we are not doing as well as we could. So we need to know why. So in order to understand who is excluded, how they are getting excluded, we have to understand where the patterns of exclusion are coming from. And this can be, simple things such as basically all the logic textbooks are written by men, and most classes on logic use a textbook, and so, I have always had to kind of push back against quota approaches to diversifying syllabi, because when you teach from one book, then it's going to be, I think that there are maybe 3 logic textbooks that are co-written by people of different genders. But, quotas don't work in this kind of context. But we also, there are other things that we can do. So I never particularly saw the lack of women in my logic contexts, but enough women have told me that they have, that we need to kind of take seriously the stories that say actually getting a woman in front of the room and doing the teaching is a beneficial thing. So we should, these are things to think about when we are doing recruitment, both for a class but also for a university program. We need to be thinking about, well, all of the work that's been done on math phobia amongst secondary school girls, how much of that also applies to logic, because there's all of these symbols and it's basically math. I tell the mathematicians it's basically math. I tell the people who like languages it's basically like learning a foreign language, and both of them believe me, and it's great. So history will tell us something about where the patterns of exclusion come from. Educational opportunities, but also societal factors such as what the kind of relationship between the formal practice of logic and broader kind of questions of reason and rationality, and who gets to speak, who gets to participate. And if we care about logic, then we should care about how our tools are weaponized. As I said, if there's one thing I want my students to take away, it is not how contraposition works. It is that if they ever hear anybody criticizing somebody for failing to be logical enough, that as logicians, we are the ones who need to say, this is not a good enough reason for excluding people from the conversation. And so in order to understand how we can counter this weaponization, we have to understand where the patterns of discrimination come from. And so that means reading with and engaging with and dealing with kind of the uncomfortable facts of British colonialism. And it's not just British colonialism. If you look at, what were the Portuguese Jesuits doing in China? They're like, let's translate our logic books, because logic is the thing that we need to give to these people. Again, to civilize them, to teach them Christianity, to convert them. And as modern logicians, we can't just ignore that this is part of the history of our subject. So with that, it's a fairly obvious conclusion, but I hope that it is, I hope I've been able to motivate it well. Knowing of the history of logic is crucial for understanding the present of logic so that we can hopefully change the future of it. Thank you very much.
All right.
Yeah.
We have a lot of questions. Pri, why don't you start?
All right. Thank you very much, Sarah. I mean, I think you give a good argument, not for studying the history of logic, but for studying the sociology of logic.
Which involves the history.
Yes, but I suppose partially involves. I mean, unless you want to equate the history of what historians of logic are studying with studying how logic is taught, how logic is, well, all the very interesting sociological questions. I don't see how that's an argument for doing history of logic.
Okay. So doing history of logic is an interesting turn of phrase, because one thing that I often want to make a distinction about is a difference between doing history of logic understood in the same way that history of philosophy tends to be understood, and doing historical logic. Historical logic is when you go back to a textbook and you open it up and you read it as if a logical textbook, and you do cool logic on it, and you go to logic conferences and you present it. That's a different kind of activity than the history of. And I think that, so the historical logic stuff, also super important, really, that kind of work is necessary in order to be able to do the historical, the priority claims and things, because you have to know what was done and how it relates to what is done modernly. But the history of, you're right, it can't be separated from the sociology of and the pedagogy of and the anthropology of, and I think that almost makes it more important.
There was a hand in the second row.
Yeah. Oh, cool, thanks. I really appreciate using the lens of these, of the assumed kind of impersonality of logic to kind of analyze the political history of the discipline. I worry about the chronopolitics of this homogenizing thing into a discipline of logic as a whole. I mean, institutional inclusion itself often reproduces access problems because of the centripetal nature of power in the academic complex.
Yeah.
Right? So how do you see yourself avoiding this threat while also trying to raise this in this context? Yeah.
So I try to take I say we start off in the first lecture with the question, what is logic? And in usually the first seminar, we're discussing who gets to count as a logician. And I'm constantly trying to motivate the broadest possible answer to these questions. So the definition of logic that we end up coming with is the study of good argument. And that covers a lot. It could even cover rhetoric, if your definition of good is merely persuasive. But it allows there to be many different things that legitimately get to count as logic and that can be studied in this context. I'm really kind of conscious of of what you say, kind of the structural nature of teaching these things in a classroom is always going to bring with it its own issues. But at least within the classroom, I can try to be as expansive and inclusive as possible. Outside of the classroom, so the pandemic and having to do online teaching gave me the opportunity to do something that I wanted to do for quite some time. And you can now take my entire first year logic course via videos on YouTube. And the number of comments that I've gotten from people who are engaging with this material, but not in any kind of formal educational context, has been surprising and gratifying. So there are ways that we can get outside of the ivory tower with what we're doing too.
Yeah, thanks so much. I have a very brief comment and question. The brief comment is about orientalization of logic. What you were saying reminded me a lot of Edward Said's, he starts the book Orientalism by having these quotations from governors of Egypt, and one of the first one is saying that, well, these people, Arabs in Egypt, don't even have logic, which is
Yeah.
I was very fascinated, so now to my question, by this idea that you suggested in the beginning that logic historically was a social thing. So, because this is not how everyday student thinks about logic.
Oh yeah.
Think about this extremely esoteric thing that like these people sit in their dark rooms do like this math and
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, do you think it changed at some moment? And because again, I think you're right, because historically, like again, thinking about Arabic, like well, Funaji, who I think is the greatest logician of this time, like he was the governor, he was like the supreme judge of Egypt. So like we cannot be more politically influential than this.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was apparently important part of kind of social engagement. But when did it change? Like, or did it change and why?
So I can't say for certain, and this is in part because you still see it in, like the public disputation aspect of logic within kind of university contexts into the 16th, 17th centuries. The 18th century is a big black hole in my knowledge, and by the 19th century, it's already shifting into the private. So something happened in there, and I don't know what. But I do know something about the mechanisms, which is one interesting way of kind of tracing the path of at least sort of the Western story of logic is by looking at when was logic considered a linguistic discipline and when was it considered mathematical. And there is a close connection when logic is a tool for speaking, for language, for understanding, for debate, arguments in speech, then it has a lot of these it has a lot more public use and public applicability. Once it starts, as happens quite a bit over the 19th century, getting very much co-opted into this mathematical context, then you lose the dialogical aspects. And therefore, you don't need to have somebody else. You can do it in private.
Thank you so much. Thank you for an amazing talk, Sarah. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to, I guess, outsource a bit of labor to you.
Excellent.
I have this argument with history skeptic colleagues quite a lot, who often operate with this sort of, I guess, narrow epistemic conception of like what philosophy is for, that then leads them to kind of devalue or disvalue certain aspects of the history of philosophy.
Yeah.
They're kind of connected to the epistemic gains you list at one of the slides. So I mean, lots of my colleagues, for example, have this view that the point of philosophy is knowledge or truth or something like that, and it has some kind of single unified goal. And what's nice about philosophy is we all like get at that goal from these like different angles. We're all climbing the mountain from different sides or whatever. And relative to like some of the kind of bits of knowledge, like discrete bits of knowledge that other disciplines can get at, like super techie metaphysics or like trolley problems, whatever you're doing, right? The epistemic gains that the history of philosophy get us, things like priority claims or attribution claims or canon expansion, although they might constitute bits of knowledge, they look, again, according to some of my colleagues, meager compared to like some of the other gains we could make in philosophy. And so this kind of, although I think the narrow conception of philosophy is bad for other reasons, it's very popular and very pervasive.
Yeah.
And so I wondered like how you would respond to that kind of argument. Like what's the right way for, is it to kind of make the case that we can expand the list of epistemic gains? Is it to try to make the epistemic gains seem more significant? Is it to reject the model of philosophy? So
yeah, I mean, I think it's going to depend very much on kind of the particular circumstance that you're in. Are you having a casual chat with your colleagues? Are you in a job interview? Are you, various things? I mean, the kind of, in the context where you are in a position of stability and potentially power, absolutely go for the change your conception of philosophy. It's just fundamentally flawed. But in other contexts, I think that there is value in emphasizing the epistemic value of the gains that might seem from the outside as very little or very small. And I know one of the reasons I enjoy reading medieval texts on logic is because I will often find things and be like, oh, hey, I'd never thought about that before. And neither has anybody else in the modern period. So that's where my third bullet point there is. So there is in temporal logic, there is a while connective, while x do y, and it's very well studied in computer science. There's a bunch of 13th century texts that are looking at the connectives where and while, but where the while connects to declarative statements, not a declarative and an imperative. I have not found this connective discussed by any modern temporal logician, and it seems like quite a natural one. And I wrote a paper on it, and I got this from having read the history. And so the fact that kind of thing can happen should itself be a sufficient justification for why doing the history of logic or history of philosophy or history of anything is valuable, because you never know what you're going to find.
My question is, do you think that exists a fundamental difference between the history of logic and the logic of history?
Ooh, boy. I'm not sure I have a good enough understanding of what the logic of history would be to know if it is different, but I suspect that it is, because I suspect that when people are kind of using logic in that kind of way, they are thinking in a very sort of, it's almost like the narrative or the story or the causal kind of reasons behind how history has developed in the way that it has. And certainly looking at the history of logic is going to have a lot of elements of that, but I think kind of the broader question of like, why did history happen the way that it did, definitely goes beyond that. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, as you know, when we try to revise the canon in other areas of philosophy, and we try to include women in particular, very often these efforts get dismissed or rejected because these women are talking about women issues, not universal stuff, men, women issues, and like education, children, marriage, and it's just, a question that came to my mind as you were talking is this something that's just not possible in logic?
I mean, there's a view of logic that says part of why classical logic is the logic is because logic is content independent. It doesn't say anything about the world. It is just kind of maybe about the structure of reality or something. And even amongst like fairly narrow-minded logicians, I think that this is not really a view that anybody really expresses anymore. There are absolutely things that one can do with logic that, feminist logic is an actual subfield. It does exist. You can do things in it. And lots of people would look at that and be like, oh, but that's only about women issues, gender issues. We men don't need to care about that. So, yes. Yeah. So, if I had my laptop with me, I could give you the list. People put Ada Lovelace on the list, but I think this is because you are always stretching to push your history back as far as you can. Within the Western context, there really isn't anybody before people like Lad Franklin, Jones, Welby, etc. There are some other ones kind of working in that period. I have a slightly stalled project where I'm kind of looking at bringing a canonical piece from each of these women that lived before 1899 to bring them together into a collected volume where you could then go and read all of these pieces. But So I've got a list of people, but I'm not going to know the names off the top of the head. But it really, like, you're not going to find anybody in the Western tradition before 1860. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering, this question might be a bit similar. So in some areas of philosophy, correcting the sort of epistemic standpoint is crucial. So when studying, say, philosophy of biology, and everything is sort of male investigators tend to take the male condition as normative, right? And correcting that is very important. In what sense has incorporating female epistemic standpoint led to content or substantial sort of theoretical differences within the study of logic itself? So the content of logic, and not simply the sort of like the social
the practice,
story
yeah.
of logic.
So less about, specifically female or women standpoints, but more, kind of slightly more broadly, gender minority standpoints. There's been a lot of work used to develop non-classical logics that don't rely on there being this binarism between man and woman. So this is something that Val Plumwood argued against classical logic with respect to that when you have a classical negation, you don't have male and female, man and woman. You have male and non-male. You have man and non-man. And so the result of kind of classical negation is this homogenization of everything that is non-man, such that I and this cup end up in the same category. And one of the, you can develop logics that drop classical negation or that are constructing things in a different way, such that your logic doesn't, isn't what leads you to this kind of binary division between genders. So that's one example.
Thank you. Thank you for this talk. Really, really wonderful. I think in my own sort of motivation in what I do, I am myself less moved by the representation and the inclusion aspects and more by the learning new things and asking new questions thing. But you did speak mostly about the mechanism of exclusion and that part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to bring into the room an aspect of the mechanism of inclusion that I feel just does not get mentioned often enough, is much, much more important, and that's class, right?
Yeah.
You cannot, you can put your lectures out there, and that's great, but the location where people get exposure to the disciplines we love and want to share and get disciplined in those subjects is the university. Who has access to university and on what terms? So if you are taking out 10,000 or 100,000 pounds, euros, dollars alone, you don't study something, to study at university, you don't study something useless. You just don't. And I think that's really an important mechanism of exclusion in philosophy especially, but all of these useless disciplines. And I think we need to talk about it more, because it's the one that all the others we can sort of say, oh, we just need to think differently, and let's be less biased, and just be better people, and pick ourselves up by our bootstraps, and so on. But there's structural features here that just carry on. And until they don't, we're not going to have real change.
This is a really good point, and you're right. I didn't say very much at all about class in this context, but it is something that I actually talk about in my classes, because one of the things I ask students to do on the first day is I tell them, look around the room, who is in the room and who is not, and what are the reasons why they aren't. And yeah, I've as you say, the class issue is in many respects actually much more difficult to try to tackle, because a lot of it happens so much earlier than university. I mean, it basically requires a complete upheaval of how societies function so that we can ensure that that those who are currently in the lowest of the classes get brought up. But yeah, difficult.
Once you're there, right? You don't study something you can't get a job in if you're going into debt.
Right. But if we completely restructured society so that debt didn't exist, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm very interested in human ontology and especially philosophy of mind. And I don't know if my question makes any sense at all, but from outside of the field of logic, are there any main views on human reason, whether in contemporary logic or in history of logic?
So there's a lot of really interesting work that's done in places like my PhD alma mater, the Institute for Logic, Language and Computation at the University of Amsterdam, where there's a lot of logicians and psychologists working in tandem. And basically the kind of view that logicians have of human reasoning is that humans are not logical at all. They're very bad. Their reasoning patterns do not generally follow modus ponens and contraposition and universal instantiation and all of this. That's the pessimistic view of kind of human reasoning. The more optimistic view is that we simply haven't kind of built the relevant logical tools in order to be able to articulate what is good about human reasoning. But yeah, there is definitely this sort of gap in practice between what logicians hold up and what's and how we actually reason. And in fact, one of the reasons why I tell my students I try to motivate this definition of logic as the study of good arguments is to kind of point out that there is this gap. Like deductive validity, deductive arguments with true premises, this is a gold star standard for goodness. If you've got one of them, that's great. The vast majority of time, we do not have things like this. And that's okay, because the purposes that we are using them for are not to extract necessary unchanging truths about the world, but to provide epistemological grounding for claims that we make or decisions that we make. And so this is when I then, where we kind of get to this point in the class, and then I'm like, and here's the Buddhist logic. And now you get to see what it looks like when what your main purpose of reasoning is for is to provide foundations for knowledge, as opposed to building deductive arguments. So I think that there is, it's very easy to say humans don't reason logically, but you can only say that if your view of logic is very narrow and counts as classical deductive logic.
Any other questions?
I was wondering whether you think there are any sort of methodological consequences for how to do the history of philosophy, or questions to ask of historical texts that follow from sort of the approach you were taking, which goes a bit back to a question that was asked there.
Yeah.
Whether you could expand on that a little.
Pay more attention to logic when you're doing history of philosophy, that's one. But that's a very self-serving sort of answer. So methodological questions, I think that one thing that we as historians are probably, we probably know that we need to do this and do actually do it, but it's sometimes useful to kind of articulate it a bit more explicitly, which is the value of the serendipity. That one of the exciting things about doing history of logic or history of philosophy is that you don't know what you're going to find when you go off and you start looking. And so a methodological point is to just kind of be open to what you might find along the way. You might have a particular project that you're engaged on and be, collecting information, reading these manuscripts, looking at these sources, but there might be something else that you find along the way, and just kind of remembering to be open to that rather than to say, oh, but it doesn't fit into the project that I'm working on. And this, I think, also sort of goes back to the other comments over there, which is like, well, how do we justify what we do? in part, it is that, if we're too prescriptive about what gets to count as philosophy or as logic, then we are shutting off a lot of interesting avenues for discoveries that we haven't yet made. I mean, you can sort of draw a parallel with like very foundational medical research or foundational physics. It's like, we're doing this research not because we have an end goal in mind, but because we might discover something that turns out to be really, really useful or interesting in the future. And I think that that's just kind of a good methodological approach to have, whether you're doing history of logic or history of philosophy.
Thank you very much. I really like your example about why non-classical negation is interesting, or why classical negation is not really apt if
Yeah.
you want to describe something. And this made me think, well, these things that we want to consider and keep fixed, or if not just believe that they are true, but they are true, can influence logic to this point. Okay, I'm going to touch controversial matter here, but can us find a way, or provide us another way to find an answer to what is the right logic among paraconsistent
Yeah.
FDE? Because it seems that now we are saying, well, perhaps classical logic is not the best because of these things that do not work well with classical logic.
Yeah. So, I mean, asking the question, what is the right logic or the one true logic, has a very big presupposition, which is that there is exactly one. And I think kind of increasingly, the people who are working in non-classical contexts generally reject that view. There are some, like you can talk to intuitionists who are like, yes, there is one true logic, and it's intuitionistic logic, not classical. But whenever people kind of approach me with this question, do I think there's the one true logic or not? I think that there's another question that needs to be asked kind of behind this, which is like, well, what is your purpose in asking this question? Like, what are you going to get out of it? Is the actual question, how do I know what the right logic is to use in a particular context? And, and if you think that there's one, then it's not just a particular context, but, what is the right logic to use in all contexts? And I think that kind of getting at that question is then when kind of more useful conversations can start. So I am radically pragmatic about logic. It is a toolbox of tools that I get to do fun things with, and if one works, that's great, and if one doesn't, it doesn't. And then I will pick something else instead. So I don't really have anything normative behind my use of logic beyond whatever tool I pick from my toolbox. I need to be able to give you a convincing explanation for why that one is better than another one.
So I have a somewhat open-ended question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And especially given the title of the talk, and it's about basically how you see the future of logic, but more specifically is, do you think that these discovering all these different traditions and different medieval authors and whatever sort of shape how logic is developing right now, or should it shape?
It definitely should. It does to a very small extent. I mean, there are, 20 years ago, I mean, yeah, for quite a large part of my early academic career, I would be the only person turning up to the mathematical logic conferences giving talks on medieval stuff. That's not the case anymore. More and more people are realizing, oh, there's interesting things that we can learn by going back and looking at these texts. And so it's becoming more and more commonplace for people to talk about Bradwardine and Occam and Duns Scotus and all of this. So there is that kind of change. I think that at this point, things like the development of feminist logic as a robust subfield of logic, it's just too early to see if there's any big, I mean, the fact that the subfield has developed is definitely a change, But where this will, like, kind of what kinds of consequences it will be, you know, is it in 10 years everybody will be teaching this? Is it in 20? Is it in 50? We'll just have to find out.